Hello and welcome to this tutorial on Vue JS. Before we get started with this tutorial, I just want to mention a few things. This video contains the first section of my online course named Vue JS from beginner to professional. It covers the basics of Vue JS and everything you need to know to build simple applications with Vue. Now there's more to Vue JS than what's covered in this video, especially if you want to build advanced applications. So while this video will be a great starting point for you, I encourage you to check out my course if you want to take your Vue JS skills to the next level. And if you use the link in the description, then you will get a 75% discount. Also, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up as it helps me a lot. Alright, enough introduction, let's get started learning Vue JS. It's time to start writing some code. Let's start things off with the classic Hello World example. The first thing we need to do is to actually make Vue JS available to our very first Vue JS application. In order to do that, I have opened up a browser and navigated to vuejs.org. Let's find the installation instructions by first clicking the Get Started button, and then clicking the installation link in the left-hand menu. Here we have various options, from downloading the JavaScript file using a CDN to using the Vue CLI with Webpack and more. Some of these options are a bit complicated at first, so let's stick to the easy way and get back to the others when we have gone through the basics of Vue JS. So to use Vue JS within JS Fiddle, I'll make use of the CDN. So all I need from this page is the URL to the Vue.js file. So if I scroll down to the CDN section and click the first link, I can now simply copy the address from the page that just opened. This is the URL that I need to use within JS Fiddle. Now all I have to do is add this URL within a script tag. So I'll just go ahead and do that. That's all we need to use Vue.js for now. With that out of the way, let's get to the interesting part, coding. At the heart of Vue.js is something that we call a Vue instance. A Vue instance is responsible for controlling a piece of HTML code, also referred to as a template, which is then rendered in the browser. In terms of code, a Vue instance is simply an object that is initialized from the Vue constructor function. Let's now create our first Vue instance by simply writing new Vue, like that. Now this is not going to do anything in itself, because we must pass in some options to the constructor in terms of a JavaScript object. The most important property in this object right now is one called EL, short for element. This property should contain a string value with the CSS selector that matches the HTML element that we want the Vue instance to control. Let's say that we want our Vue instance to control an element with an ID of app, in which case we would enter the ID prefixed with a hashtag sign. Like so. The next thing we need to do is to start writing the template for the Vue instance. Since we just defined that it should control an element with an ID of app, let's create a div element with this ID. Of course, you're free to use any identifier that you like, or even a class if you prefer, in which case you would use a selector with a period instead of a hashtag sign. So let's create the div. I'll just use a shortcut within JS Fiddle, like that. Now instead of just writing hello world directly in the HTML, let's make it more dynamic by using something called string interpolation. In order to do that, we have to first shift our attention back to our Vue instance and introduce a new property named data. As its name implies, this is where we'll add the data that we want to be accessible within our Vue instance, and thereby within our template as well. This property must be an object of key value pairs. Let's say that we want to store a message within the Vue instance. So we add a key named message with a value of hello world. like so. But what does that actually do for us? This data is now accessible to us from within our template, and we can now use string interpolation to output it. Now, string interpolation is basically just a fancy word for outputting data in our template by using double curly bracket syntax, as you will see now. Now, I actually want to output the message, so I will add a header and use string interpolation within it. Notice the double curly bracket syntax, which both opens and closes the string interpolation. Within the curly brackets, we can write the name of our data property that we would like to output, in this case, message. Notice that we do not need to write data.message, as one might have thought was required. This is because Vue JS proxies the data to make it available without this prefix. We'll get back to this in a later video, so don't worry if that doesn't make too much sense right now. The important thing is to keep in mind that the data keys can be accessed directly, as in this example. Another thing to note is that you don't need to store the newly created instance in a variable. This is only necessary if you need to use it later on in your script. Alright, so let's actually try to run this code and see if it does what we expect. Looking at the right hand side of the screen, we can see that our message is indeed being output as we would expect. So what happens here is that our Vue instance is controlling the div, which we specified within the CSS selector in the EL property. This element and all of its childs therefore have access to the data that we have specified within the data property in our Vue instance. We use this when we use string interpolation to output our message within our template. Something interesting that we don't see here is that Vue JS actually watches our data properties for changes, and if a value changes, this is automatically reflected in the DOM and thereby on the page. So while this example probably doesn't look that impressive to you, there's actually a lot of things happening behind the scenes that we will go through in more details later in the course. But for now, we have just created our very first Vue JS application. Now that you've seen how to set up Vue JS and JS Fiddle, I just want to briefly show you how you can set up a simple development environment on your own machine. To keep things simple, I'm not going to get into Webpack or the Vue CLI now, as I will cover this in later videos. So to easily get up and running, there are two simple approaches right now. The first being to use the CDN, as we did in the previous video. The first thing I'll do is to create an HTML file that will contain pretty much the same code as you saw in the previous video. So let me just go ahead and create that. I'll just call it index.html. I don't need a title for now. And I'll just create the markup here, as we saw previously. I'll just create a header and output message. The next thing we need to do is to add a script tag for Vue.js. So I'll just go ahead and grab the CDN URL from vuejs.org. So I can find it here. I scroll down and I just need to open this link and copy this URL. And now I can add a script tag with an src attribute and paste it in there. So now it's time to add our JavaScript code. I'll just add this inline at the bottom of the page, but it could also be loaded from an external file. So I'll add another script tag here with type of text/JavaScript. And in here, I'll just add a new Vue instance with an object as an argument. I'll say the element is app with the selector. I'll say data is an object and message will be hello world, like so. If I open the HTML page in a browser, we should see hello world being rendered on the page. And sure enough, everything looks to be working correctly. Alternatively, you can download the Vue.js file instead of using the CDN. So let's quickly go ahead and do that. I'll just save the JavaScript file from vuejs.org and save it in my project's root directory. So now you can see on the left hand side that I now have the file. Now all that's left to do is to replace the URL in the script tag with a path on the file system that is relative to the project directory. So in here, I can actually just write Vue.js. So if I open up the browser again and refresh the page, we should see the same result as before, and indeed we do. So if you prefer to follow along with this setup rather than using JS Fiddle, then this is how you can do it. Later in the course, I will get back to setting up a more advanced development environment, but for now, these options are sufficient. We have already walked through the basics of using templates in Vue.js, where we saw how to use string interpolation to output data. I want to expand a bit on that and show you that you can also use simple JavaScript expressions within the string interpolation syntax. The reason I said simple JavaScript expressions is that you can only include a single expression. Therefore, you cannot use loops or any complex logic. This is okay anyways, as such logic would not belong in our template either way. It would be better off being placed within a method in our Vue instance, something that I will get back to in the next video. For now, let me just show you a simple example. Suppose I have an age property within my data object, which contains an arbitrary number. For whatever reason, I want to output this number multiplied by 2. I can do so by adding a simple JavaScript expression directly in my template within the string interpolation syntax. So I'll add an h1 element, and I'll add the double curly bracket syntax as usual. And here I can write the name of my data property and multiply it by 2. Here I just multiplied the age property by 2, and if I run the code, we should see the expected number being output. Remember that I could access the age property directly within my template because Vue.js proxies the data property for me, so I did not have to access the property on the data object explicitly. In fact, if you tried to do so, it wouldn't work. Let's take a look at how we can use Boolean logic within our template. Since you can only use a single expression, you cannot use normal if statements. However, what you can do is to use shorthand if statements. Suppose that I want to output whether a person is old or young. I could check if the age property is greater than a certain number, and if so, output an arbitrary string. So let's remove what we already had, and I'll say age is greater than 60, then I'll write old, and otherwise I'll write young. So this is normal JavaScript syntax, nothing special about that. In this case, I check if the age property contains a number that is greater than 60. In that case, I'll output old, and otherwise young will be displayed. If I run the code, it luckily determines that I'm still young, which is pretty fortunate for me. If I change the age property to 60, it will output old instead. Let's see one more example of an expression. I will add my full name to a new property called name. Like so. The value includes both my first and last name, but I only want to display my first name on the page. What I can do is to split the name by spaces. So if I remove the existing expression, I can write name.split, and this is just a split JavaScript function, nothing special about it in the context of Vue.js. And I'll just split by space here. So if I run this, an array of 2 elements will be output. To output my first name, I can output the element at index 0, like this. If I run the code now, you'll see my first name being output. This was just another example of an expression. You can do a lot of things with a single JavaScript expression, but just try to keep it simple. If you need more complex logic, then you should not try to force it into the template, such as nested shorthand if statements, for example. Also, if you need to use the same expression multiple times in your template, then it would probably be better to not embed it within the template itself, but within the Vue instance instead. This can be done with methods, which we'll take a look at now. In previous lectures, we've seen how we can output data with string interpolation. But what if we need to output data based on certain rules or logic? In that case, it might be handy to have a function in which we can embed JavaScript logic. Or perhaps we want to fetch data from a remote service or something like that. For this purpose, it's time to introduce a new property to our Vue instance, the methods property. This property should contain an object where the key is the name of a function and the value is the function itself. Let's see an example of this. Let's use my name as an example again, but this time stored in two different properties, first name and last name. So I'll add this within the data property, and I'll say first name is Bo, last name is Anderson. To output my full name, I could of course concatenate these two data properties with string interpolation with a space in between, or simply output them by using string interpolation twice. But that wouldn't be any fun, would it? Instead, let's add a method, i.e. function, which can do this for us. As mentioned earlier, functions have to be added under the methods property. So let's go ahead and add this, like so. Don't worry too much about the terminology here. The property is named methods because this is what we call functions that are in the context of an object and that can operate upon the data that is contained within the object. In this case, the object is the Vue instance. The key within this object will be the name of the method. In this case, the name getFullName seems appropriate and descriptive. So I'll just use that. And the value is going to be a function, like so. Methods can be used for various things, as you will see in the upcoming lectures, but for now I want the method to return a string value that can be output through string interpolation. So how can we access the data properties within this method? Vue JS proxies our data and methods to be available in this context. So by writing this.firstName, we can access the first name property within the data object. Note that this is required. With this, we can easily concatenate the first and last name and return the result. So I'll just add a space between, like so, and I'll return the result of this concatenation. Again, note that Vue JS proxies the data and methods keys to be available within this context. So when writing this.firstName, for example, we are accessing the first name property within the data object. If we wanted to, we could access other methods from within our getFullName method by using the same approach, just with parentheses at the end to make it a method invocation. Alright, so now that we have implemented our method, let's use it from within our template. This is as easy as you would expect it to be. Simply write the method name followed by parentheses. So let's do that within string interpolation. And I'll write getFullName and parentheses. As it turns out, Vue JS proxies methods as well in addition to the data object's properties. So if I run this code, we should see my name being output on the page. Let's try a slightly different approach. What if we wanted to pass the first and last name to the method as arguments instead of having the method access the data properties directly? We can easily do so by adding parameters to the method as we would do in vanilla JavaScript. I'm going to use different names for the parameters so that they don't match the properties of the data object, just to prove that we are no longer relying on those within our method. So let me just add the parameters. I'll name them first and last, and then I'll just change this. Now I no longer need the this keyword because now I'm using the parameters instead of the data property. And then within the template, we simply have to pass in the values by using the appropriate property names from the data object. So in this case, that will be first name and last name. running the code should give us the same result as before, and indeed it does. You're not bound to return only strings from a method that is used within string interpolation, although you will most commonly do so. You can also return objects and arrays, for example. Let's see how we can refactor our method to return an object instead of a string. I can just return an object directly with a name property as you would expect, nothing out of the ordinary here. So let's do that. I'll return a new object here. I'll set a name property on the object and it will just be what we had before. So first concatenate it with last with a space in between. In the template, we still invoke the method as before. Running the code will print out the object, which is not exactly what we want. So after the method invocation, we can simply write a period followed by the name of the property that we want to access, name in this case. Running the code once again will show the same result. This would also work with nested objects. Before ending this lecture, I just want to give you a word of caution. If you try to make use of ES6 arrow functions within the methods object, you will not be able to access other methods or data properties. This is because arrow functions are bound to the parent context, and therefore the this keyword will not refer to the Vue instance as you would expect. Therefore, any data properties or methods you would try to access this way would be undefined. The solution is simple: use ES6 syntax for functions within the methods objects. These were the basics of using methods within the Vue instance and how to invoke them from a template. In the upcoming lectures, we'll see how we can use methods to respond to events and more. Before moving on, I just want to mention a thing or two about the ES6 arrow functions. While they are really useful in many cases, you also have to be a bit cautious with them. Let's take the example from the previous lecture and see what happens if we change the full name method to an arrow function. So I'll just change the syntax here and I'll add an arrow there, like so. Now we suddenly see undefined being displayed on the page instead of my name. That's because arrow functions are bound to the parent context, and therefore this will not refer to the Vue instance as you would expect. Let's actually see this by logging this to the console. So I'll just write console.log and this. So let's open up the browser's inspector. I'll just clear this out and I'll run the code once again. As we can see, this refers to the window object, which is not really what we expected. That's why there are no first name or last name properties available to us in that context. In comparison, let's see what is logged when we use a normal function as before. So I'll just revert this back to a normal function and clear out the console and run the code again. Now we see the Vue instance being output as we would have expected in the first place. So the moral of the story is that you should not try to use arrow functions on Vue instance properties where Vue tries to bind this to the Vue instance itself. There are still times where you can use arrow functions with all their benefits. For instance, if you assign a function to a variable within one of your Vue instance's methods, then you can access this within the arrow function and it would point to the Vue instance as you would expect. Just be aware of where you use these arrow functions, and if you experience some strange behavior with this not pointing to what you expect, then it might be related to arrow functions. That's just something to be aware of. Now that we have covered string interpolation and methods, it's time to talk about something called directives. Directives apply special reactive behavior to the render DOM. You will see what this means during the next couple of videos, but the easiest way to wrap your head around it is to see an example. Suppose that I want to link to my blog and I have the URL stored within the data object on the Vue instance. I have prepared the Vue instance in advance because it contains nothing that you haven't seen before. I've already created an empty link within the template as well. So how can we make the link point to the URL stored within the block URL data property? Could we just use string interpolation as we've seen before? Well, let's try. So I'll just enter the string interpolation syntax here and enter block URL to match the data property. Running this code and hovering over the link, we can see that things do not work as expected. The string interpolation syntax is output and the browser URL encodes it. This is because we cannot use string interpolation in any HTML attributes. Instead, we can use a directive named v-bind. So let me remove what we already had and I'll enter v-bind here instead. The v-bind directive binds attributes to an expression. Right now we haven't specified the attribute nor the expression, so let's do that. After the name of the directive, we add a colon, followed by the name of the HTML attribute that we would like to bind to. In this case, we are interested in the href attribute, so I'll simply write href right here. The last missing piece is the expression. In this case, we just need to access the block URL data property, so all we need to do is to add an equals sign, followed by the expression enclosed within quotation marks. So the expression is going to be block URL, referring to the data property that we have already defined. If I run the code again, we can see that it now works as intended. To recap, the syntax for directives consists of the name of the directive, a colon, an argument to the directive, and an expression. The reason I said that the second part of the syntax is an argument to the directive rather than an HTML attribute name is that the attribute name is actually an argument to the v-bind directive. So this syntax is used for directives in general, and the v-bind directive takes an argument, which is the name of the HTML attribute to bind to. Now, not all directives take arguments, as we'll see in the coming videos. The last part of the directive syntax is the expression. In this case, we just refer to a data property, but for other directives, we can also refer to methods. Now, I mentioned earlier that directives apply reactive behavior to the DOM. In this case, the HTML element in the DOM is updated automatically whenever the value of our block URL data property changes. I'm going to show this to you in one of the next lectures, so for now you'll just have to take my word for it. But what we're basically telling Vue JS in this example is to keep the href attribute up to date with the block URL property on the Vue instance. Directives are, as you have probably noticed, prefixed by v and a dash to indicate that they are special attributes that Vue JS will recognize. In fact, it's possible to write your own directives, which is something that we'll take a look at later. In this lecture, you have been introduced to the concept of Vue JS directives and its general syntax, with the v-bind directive being an example hereof. Don't worry if you didn't understand everything covered in this video, as we'll be working with a lot of directives throughout this course. In the next lectures, we'll be taking a look at more Vue directives, but first, it's time to practice what we've learned so far. Having looked at string interpolation, methods, and briefly touched the concept of directives, let's practice what we've learned so far by doing a bit of exercises. I have 3 exercises for you. First, I want you to store the name of a movie and its release year in 2 data properties and output the values using string interpolation. You can use any data values that you want. For the second exercise, I want you to output whether or not the movie is old. The movie is old if it was released in the past century, i.e. before year 2000. To do this, you should use a method to determine whether or not the movie is old and output the result accordingly. For the last exercise, I want you to bind the title attribute of the div element to the data property that contains the name of the movie, such that when you hover your mouse over the div, the title will be displayed. So if you're up for it, go ahead and pause this video now and give it a shot yourself. I'll be back with my solution in just a moment. Alright, I hope you managed to do it. Let's walk through the solution together. Beginning with the first exercise, let's begin by adding the two data properties that we need. I'll name them movie title and release year. I'll use the matrix as an example that was released in year 1999. Alright, so far so good. With this, we can simply output the values with the string interpolation syntax as we've seen before. So I'll use the double curly bracket syntax and I'll enter movie title, which is the name of my data property. And I'll do the same for the release year. Actually, I'll just remove the D right here. Let's run the code and verify that everything looks good. With that, let's move on to exercise number 2. For this exercise, there are a few ways to solve it, and I will show you a few of them. My first approach is to implement a method that returns the string that I want to output, which is the simplest approach. I'll first add the methods objects in which I'll add the new method. So I'll go down here, I'll write methods, colon, and an empty object. And I will name the method isMovieOld, like this. So I'll add a property of that name and a function as its value. This method should return the string old if the release year is less than 2000 and new otherwise. I will return an expression consisting of a shorthand if statement, but you can write this more explicitly if you prefer. So I'll say this.release year less than 2000, then I'll return old and otherwise new. Remember that within methods, we need to use the this keyword to access data properties or other methods, because Vue JS proxies this for us to be available within this context, which is the this context. With the method in place, let's turn our attention to the template. With this approach, all we need to do is to invoke the method from within string interpolation syntax, such that the return value of the method is output. So I'll go up here, replace this with some string interpolation, and I'll simply write isMovieOld and parenthesis, which is the name of our method. And let's just see that it works. Now, of course, we could pass in the release year as an argument to the method to make it slightly more generic. So let's go ahead and do that. By adding a parameter with the name of release year to the function, I also have to remove the this keyword to make use of it correctly. Like so. Within the template, I can simply write the name of the data property that I want to pass as an argument within the parentheses. So up here, I'll just write release year, which matches data property name. Run the code and everything still works. But let's make this just a little bit cleaner by only having the method tell us whether or not the movie is old and not what to output. Returning a Boolean value will give us what we want, i.e. true if the movie is old and false otherwise. I can do this by simply deleting the shorthand if statement and only return the expression which evaluates to a Boolean value. Like so. Then, within the template, I will invoke this method within the string interpolation syntax as before, but this time with a shorthand if statement that uses the return value of the method. So let's change this. I'll add the shorthand if statement here. And if the movie is old, I'll output old. Otherwise, I'll output new, exactly as we did within the method before. So I'll run the code and it still works. So those were a few approaches to solving exercise number 2. So let's solve the last exercise now. As you saw in the previous video on directives, we can bind a data property to an HTML element's attribute in the DOM by using the v-bind directive. First, we type out the name of the directive, vbind in this case. So let's enter it here, vbind, like so. Then we add a colon and pass in an argument. In the case of the vbind directive, we pass in the name of the HTML attribute that we would like to bind to. Since we want to bind to the title attribute, I will enter title here. Last but not least, I will append an equal sign, followed by the name of the data property that we want to bind within quotation marks. So in this case, it's movie title. That's it. Hovering the mouse over the div element will reveal the movie's title after just a moment. And with that, we have solved all of the exercises for this lecture. So let's move on to learning some more directives. Remember how we can embed simple JavaScript expressions within the string interpolation syntax? Well, we can actually do the same with directives. Without further ado, let's see an example of using an expression. So I have added a Vue instance in advance, which simply contains my full name in 2 data properties, and a div element, which just contains some text. What I want to do now is to use the vbind directive to bind an expression to the title attribute. The expression is simply going to concatenate the 2 data properties. So let's add the vbind directive here, colon, and the name of the HTML attribute, which is title in this case. And as for the expression, I'm going to say first name, which is the name of my data property, plus a space within single quotes and last name. So this expression is a plain JavaScript expression which accesses the data properties that we have defined on the Vue instance. So let's run it and see that it works. What's very interesting is that Vue JS automatically keeps track of which properties a given expression depends on. If one of the dependencies are updated, the directive is refreshed, i.e. the expression is re-evaluated. Now that's pretty cool, isn't it? While you can indeed add expressions within your template, you should avoid putting too much logic in there. It's fine to use expressions, but you should try to keep them simple. Otherwise, you're better off placing the code within a method on the Vue instance instead. So far, we've seen how Vue JS reacts to changes in our data and updates the DOM accordingly, based on our template. But how can we react to DOM events, such as when a user clicks a button, for example? Obviously, we want users to be able to interact with our web application, and events are a central part of that. With that, it's time to introduce a new directive, namely the v-on directive. The v-on directive attaches an event listener to an element and takes the event type as an argument. The directive's expression can be either the name of a method or an inline expression, as we saw in the previous lecture. The simplest example I can think of is probably showing an alert in response to clicking a button. I have already added a button to the template, but right now it doesn't do anything. I'll just quickly add a method which triggers an alert. So I'll add a method object here. In here I'll add a clicked button method, which is a function. And I'll just display an alert saying you clicked the button. Now we're ready to connect the 2 pieces and trigger the click event. First, I will enter the name of the directive on the element within the template. So the name of the directive is v-on. Then I'll add a colon and an argument with the name of the event that we would like to listen to. In this case, we're interested in the click event, so I will simply enter click here. The expression is the name of our method, which is click button. So I'll just enter this as the expression. And with this, we should see an alert whenever we click the button. So let's try that out. And indeed, we see an alert. In the next video, we'll see how we can pass arguments to event listeners. By default, the native JavaScript event object is passed as the first argument to the method that we define, unless we actively change this. Adding an event parameter to the method will thus give us access to this object, and we can output it to the console to see what it looks like. So I'll add a parameter here named event and log it to the console like so. Let's open the browser's console and run the code. Note that you are free to choose the name of the parameter. Opening the browser's console and running the code will show a mouse event object after clicking the button. This is a native JavaScript object and has nothing to do with Vue JS. For other types of events, we would of course see different event objects being passed as the first argument. Perhaps you noticed that I did not add any parentheses after the method name in the template. You could do this, but then there is something to watch out for. Let's go ahead and do it and see what happens. So I'll add the parentheses here and run the code. So we still get the alert as before, but notice that we now see undefined being output in the console instead of a mouse event object as before. What just happened is that we changed from defining the method name to adding an expression, in this case a method invocation. When we do this, Vue JS no longer passes the native JavaScript event object as an argument automatically, and that is why the method parameter is undefined. But what if we do want to access the event object within our method? Vue JS allows us to specify a special argument named $event, which ensures that the native event object is passed as an argument at that particular position. Adding that between the parentheses should give us what we expect. So I can simply write $event here, and let's just clear the console, run the code again, and click the button. And indeed, we see the mouse event object being output once again. As I mentioned, we can determine in which position we want the event argument to be passed. Let's say that we want to pass a message for the alert as the first argument to the method, and the event as the second argument. We can do this, as you would expect, by first adding another parameter to the method and then passing a string as an argument. So I'll just add a message parameter here, and I will alert this message. And within the template, I can write a string here as the first argument, and I'll just write hello world. With this, we still see the event object being output in the console, and the alert now displays the message. Therefore, if you need to pass in your own arguments to a method, then you need to include parentheses in the expression, and by doing so, you must use the $event argument if you want to access the native JavaScript event object. If you don't need any custom arguments, then you can just enter the name of the method, and the event object will be passed as an argument by default, regardless of whether or not you use it. You could of course also define the method name with parentheses and optionally the $event argument if you prefer. I personally like always including the parentheses because it's a very explicit way of showing that we are indeed invoking a method, but that's just a personal preference, and what you want to do is totally up to you. Let's take a look at something called directive modifiers. Directive modifiers are special postfixes that are denoted by a dot, indicating that a directive should be bound in some special way. The modifiers that are related to events are referred to as event modifiers. And yeah, I know what you're probably thinking. That sounds fancy and all, but what does it actually mean? While modifiers are not limited to events, let's take a look at event modifiers, as these are easy to grasp. So right now I have a div element with a nested button, both having a click event handler. which simply invokes a method that shows an alert. If I click the button and close the first alert, notice that a second alert is shown. This is because the click event for the button element propagates up the DOM and thereby triggers the click event on the div element as well. This wouldn't matter if we didn't have an event handler on the div element, but in this case we do. We can disable this default behavior by using an event modifier that corresponds to calling event.stopPropagation in JavaScript. We could actually do this too, but embedding that kind of DOM logic into our methods is probably not the best way to go. Instead, we can use the stop event modifier, which does exactly that, so let's see it in action. So I'll just enter .stop after the name of the event. So notice the syntax. I simply added a dot followed by the name of the modifier after the name of the event. If we try again, we'll see that only one alert is shown this time, which is the one triggered by the click event on the button. Because of our modifier, event propagation is stopped from here, and thus the click event on the div element is ignored. I'll just remove the div element before moving on to the next example. Like so. For whatever reason, we might want to trigger an event only once. This can be accomplished with the once modifier. If I replace the stop modifier with the once modifier, we should see that the alert is only displayed once, regardless of how many times we click the button. So let's try it out. So now that I clicked the button the first time, we do see the alert, but if I click it again, you will see that the alert is no longer displayed. What if we add an event listener to an event, but we don't want the browser to perform the default action? Perhaps we don't want to submit a form when clicking a submit button, or maybe we don't want the browser to navigate to a URL within the href property of a link. Let's take the latter example and see how we can accomplish that. So if I add a link that points to google.com, and I'll add the same click event handler as before, so v_on:click and show dialog. I'll set the target to blank, and let's just give it some text. So with this link, we'll see that the browser first shows an alert and then navigates to the link's URL. Note that the reason I added a target of _blank to the link is for the link to work with JS Fiddle, so it has nothing to do with Vue JS. If I want to prevent the browser from opening the URL, I can use the prevent modifier. This is the same as calling events.preventDefault in JavaScript. So I'll just add a period here after the click event name, and I'll add prevent, which is the name of the modifier. So let's test it out. We still see the alert, but notice that the browser no longer sends us off to Google. If we just wanted to prevent the default browser action from occurring when clicking the button, we could actually completely leave out the v_on directives expression. So let's just try to delete it, which is this part. And let's test that it still works by clicking the link. And indeed, it still works because we're no longer sent to Google. So the only thing this does is the equivalent of calling event.preventDefault in JavaScript. So if you use some event modifier, meaning that you don't need the expression, then you can simply leave it out. Before ending this video, I just want to mention that modifiers can be chained by simply separating the modifiers with dots. I'll get back to that in the next video though. There are other modifiers too, but these are the ones we need for now. I'll include a link to an overview of event modifiers in a few lectures, but for now, let's move on to talking about something called key modifiers. In the previous video, we took a look at event modifiers. In this video, we'll be looking at a more specialized category of event modifiers, namely so-called key modifiers. As the name suggests, this category of event modifiers can be used with keyboard events. Say that we have a text input, for example, and we want to do something if the user hits the enter key, such as submitting a form or something like that. We could do that by using the key up event with the VOn directive and the enter key modifier. So let's see what it looks like. I'll first add an input of the type text, and I'll add the VOn directive here with the key up event. And the event listener I'll just call pressed enter. And as for the key modifier, I'll just say .enter. The enter modifier ensures that the expression is only executed when the user releases the enter key. I'll just quickly add a method which shows an alert just so that it's easy to test. So I'll go ahead and add the methods object and a pressed enter function like so, and an alert saying you press the enter key. Running the code, you'll see that if I enter a bunch of characters, nothing happens. But if I press the enter key, then we'll see an alert. I just used the enter key modifier as an example. There are several other key modifiers built into Vue JS, such as tab, delete, ESC for escape, and space, just to mention a few. And if you need other keys than the available key modifiers, then you can use a number as the modifier instead. This number represents the character code, exactly as in vanilla JavaScript. If I replace the enter key modifier with the number 13, which is the character code for the enter key, then we should see that the alert is still showing. So let's test it. Again, nothing happens with other characters. Now I'll press enter and we get the alert. In the previous lecture, I mentioned that modifiers can be chained. Perhaps I want the event listener to only be invoked when I press either the enter or space key. First, I'll just replace 13 by enter again, as it improves readability. Like so. Then, after the enter modifier, I can add another modifier by simply adding a dot followed by the name of the modifier. In this case, I'll use the space modifier. So I'll write dot space. What this does is that the event listener is only invoked if I press either the enter or the space key. Before taking the code for a spin, I should probably rename the event handler to something less misleading, as well as rephrase the alert message. So I'll just call it pressed something interesting, like so, and I'll rename it down here too. And you press the enter or space key. Now let's test it out and verify that it works. So now I'm pressing the enter key and we get the alert. Now I'll press the space key and we also get the alert. So that was just an example of how you can chain key modifiers. And that's all there is to key modifiers. I hope that you won't get too confused when I tell you that not only is there something called key modifiers in Vue JS, but there's also something called modifier keys. Modifier keys refer to keys such as Control, Shift, Alt, and the Windows or Command keys on Mac. With modifier keys, we can trigger an event listener only when one of these keys are pressed. Modifier keys are not limited to being used in conjunction with keyboard events, as we will see in this lecture. First, let's use the key up event on a text input as we did before, this time with the shift and enter modifiers. So I'll just add the key up event once again. I'll say .shift, which is the modifier key, and .enter, which is the key modifier. And I already added an event listener named myListener, so I'll just add that as the expression. So now my simple event listener is only invoked if I press the shift and enter key simultaneously with the text input in focus. So let's test that out. So now I can enter several things and I can press enter and nothing happens. Also the same with the shift key, but if I press shift and enter at the same time, we'll see that the alert is displayed. In this example, we have once again chained multiple modifiers. In this case, a modifier key being the shift key and a key modifier being the enter key. I mentioned that modifier keys can be used with mouse events as well. Let's see this by adding a new button with a click event. So I'll say button v on click, and I'll just call the event listener my button listener and give the button some text. Let's say click here. And let's add the event listener to the methods object. So my button listener and the function, which is just going to display an alert saying you click the button. And let's try it. If I click the button, an alert is displayed each time, which is hardly any fun, let's be honest. But if I use the shift modifier key though, the event listener will only be executed if I click the button while simultaneously holding down the shift key on my keyboard. So let's do that. So I'll say dot shift after the click event name. And let's test that out. If I click the button normally, nothing really happens. But if I do that while holding down the shift key, we now see the alert. The last modifier key I want to mention is one named meta. This modifier corresponds to the command key on Mac keyboards and the Windows key otherwise. So replacing shift with meta on the button would then mean that I would have to press the command key instead, since I'm on a Mac. So let's do that. Oops. Like so. And now I press the command key and the mouse, and the alert is shown. While this works on a Mac, I haven't tested it on Windows, but it should work. The reason I say should is that when using these keys, there's always a risk that the operating system or browser has some built-in shortcut for certain key combinations. So if you do want to use the meta modifier key, then be sure to test it out and be aware of any possible collisions with other operating system or application level shortcuts. Enough theory and examples for now. Let's use what we have just learned in practice by doing a few exercises. It's time for some exercises on events and modifiers. For the first exercise, the task is to update a data property of your choice every time the key up event is fired on the input field, and to also output the value of this data property. As a small hint, you can access the value of the input field on JavaScript's native event object by accessing the value property within the target object. Exercise number 2 is about updating the data property from the first exercise, but only doing so when pressing the Control and Enter keys simultaneously. Notice that the modifier key for the Control key is named CTRL. In the last exercise, you should prevent the form from submitting when clicking the Submit button. Essentially, this means to stop the submit event on the form from firing. Pause the video and give it a shot, and I'll be back with my solutions in a moment. Alright, I hope you were able to solve the exercises if you gave it a go. To solve the 2 first exercises, I need to add a data property that will hold the data that will be entered into the text input field. I'll just call it name in this example. So I'll add the data object and a name property, and I'll just initialize it to an empty string. And I'll use string interpolation to output its value up here in the first exercise. So I'll say name here, and I can do the same for the second exercise as well. With this property in place, I'm ready to update it as I type something in the input field. For this, I will listen to the key up event and use the v-on directive as we saw previously. So I'll just enter v-on here, which is the name of the directive, and a colon, and then the event name, which is going to be key up in this case, equals, and then we're ready to enter an expression. I'll implement a simple method which takes the native JavaScript event object as an argument. So I'll go down to the Vue instance, create a methods object, and I'll just name this name key up, just to keep it somewhat descriptive. And I'll add the event object as a parameter. And in here I'll say this.name equals events.target.value. So remember that I have to use this to access the data property from within this method. Also note that I can access the input field's value on the event object by using the target object and then the value property on this object. This is plain JavaScript and has nothing to do with Vue JS. Vue JS just takes care of providing us with this object. Now I just need to add the method name as my expression in the template and I should be good to go. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll write name key up here. Let's go ahead and test it and verify that what I enter in the first field is output next to it. Seems like it's working, so that's awesome. And actually that was exercise number 1. So let's move on to the second one. So in the second exercise, we need to do the same thing, except only updating the data property when we press the Control and Enter keys simultaneously. For the first part, the solution from the first exercise was simple. But actually there's a better way. Remember that we can embed a single expression within the directive in the template. Actually, we can use that for assigning the value to the data property right there, instead of doing so within a method. So let's just prepare the template with the VOn directive and the key up event. So most of the markup is going to be the same, as you can see. I'll still use the key up event and the VOn directive, but the expression is going to contain the assignment directly. In here, I should not prefix the data property name by this. So I can write name equals $event. Remember that this is a special variable in the template. .target.value. So almost the same as we did in the method before. So the $event object gives us access to the native JavaScript object directly within the template. And the rest is exactly what I did in the first exercise. As you can see, this approach eliminates the need to implement a method just for running a single statement. It does, however, come at the cost of having a little bit of JavaScript logic within the template, but since it's only a single statement or expression, I think that is not too bad. In fact, I personally prefer this approach over the other one, but I wanted to show both of them to you, so you can choose which one you prefer yourself. Let's just verify that this approach does the same thing as the other one. So I'll run the code again, and I'll enter something in the second input field, and indeed it seems to be working. Alright, but we're not done with this exercise yet. We still need to only update the name property, only if we press the Control and Enter keys simultaneously. For that, we'll use the ctrl modifier key and the Enter key modifier. So let's do that right here. I'll say .ctrl for the modifier key and .enter for the key modifier. And that should be all I need to do. So let's run the code again. And I'll write something in the second input field and notice that nothing is updated as I write. But now if I press Ctrl Enter, we can see that the name property is updated. So that's a success. For the last exercise, I'll simply use the prevent modifier on the submit event on the form elements. So let's add a VOn directive here on the submit event. And I simply want to prevent this event from firing. So in this case, I actually don't need an expression. Note that the v-on's expression is optional, and in this case, we didn't need any. Also remember that the prevent modifier is the same as calling event.preventDefault on the native JavaScript event object. Also, note that I added the directive to the form element and not the submit element, because the submit event is triggered on the form element whenever the submit button is clicked. So let's just verify that it works. So if I click the submit button here, we'll see that nothing happens. And this shows that our code is working, because otherwise the page would be refreshed. Note that another solution could be to prevent the click event from being triggered on the submit button. However, you would typically want to do something when the user clicks the button, but just want to disable the default browser action. A common example of this would be to submit an AJAX request without reloading the page as a result of submitting the form. Also, by preventing the submit events, you also prevent the form from being submitted somehow else, such as when pressing the enter key in a text input, for example. And that's just something to keep in mind, and that's why I prefer this approach, but the other one would indeed work as well. So, those were my solutions to the exercises. In the next lecture, we'll be looking at something called two-way data binding. So, see you there.